Picture this. The year is 1940. The world fractures under the weight of war. Soldiers march across continents, cities crumble under bombardment, nations marshal their industries for destruction. But there is another battle unfolding, one fought not with weapons, but with seeds, one waged not on distant battlefields, but in backyards, farmland, and the kitchens of ordinary people clinging to survival. While history remembers the generals and the grand strategies, it has largely forgotten the quiet revolution happening in the soil beneath our feet. Imagine a world on the brink, where every calorie was a strategic resource, and food itself became a secret weapon. The story of World War II is far more complex than bombs and bullets. This is the untold story of victory gardens and ingenious crops that played a crucial, yet profoundly overlooked role in determining whether entire nations would survive or starve. Today, we're about to uncover the hidden history of humanity's most desperate and ingenious agricultural moment. Before the bombs fell and the guns thundered across continents, there existed a vulnerability that few nations had adequately prepared for: the fragility of their food systems. Throughout the 1930s, most industrialized nations had grown dangerously dependent on intricate webs of global trade and colonial supply lines. Britain, for instance, imported roughly 70% of its food, a staggering dependence that seemed manageable in times of peace, but would prove catastrophic when international shipping became a battleground. When Hitler's U-boats began their relentless campaign against Allied convoys in the Atlantic, they weren't just targeting military hardware or ammunition. They were executing a calculated strategy to starve nations into submission. The blockade tightened like a noose around the throat of the British Empire. Merchant ships laden with wheat from Canada, butter from Denmark, and meat from Argentina sank to the ocean floor in increasing numbers. By 1941 and 1942, Britain was facing a genuine existential crisis, not from invasion, but from the very real possibility of mass starvation. Rationing grew stricter with each passing month. Families received meager portions. Children went to bed hungry. The spectre of famine, that ancient apocalypse, suddenly seemed possible again in 20th century Europe. This hidden enemy, hunger itself, moved governments into unprecedented action. It wasn't patriotism or agricultural nostalgia that sparked the famous Dig for Victory campaigns across Britain, the United States, and other allied nations. It was pure desperation. Posters appeared on every corner. Radio broadcasts urged citizens to cultivate unused land. Authority figures warned that every empty plot was a betrayal of the war effort. But beneath the propaganda was a fundamental truth. If people didn't grow their own food, they would starve. The government wasn't issuing suggestions. It was issuing survival instructions. And in response, millions of ordinary people, many with absolutely no farming experience whatsoever, took up spades and hoes to become food producers. What began as a desperate measure would become one of the war's most profound social transformations. The humble potato, often relegated to the role of mere side dish in European cuisine, underwent a remarkable transformation during the Second World War. In the minds of agricultural planners and nutritionists, the potato became something far more significant. It became survival itself. Potatoes could be grown almost anywhere, in almost any soil conditions. They required minimal maintenance compared to grain crops. A single acre of potatoes could feed more people than an acre of wheat. But the genius of wartime agricultural innovation went even deeper. Scientists discovered that potatoes could be processed into powder that could be stored for months, extending its utility far beyond the harvest season. More remarkably still, potatoes were experimented with as a fuel source. Yet the potato tells only part of the story. As traditional supply chains collapsed and rationing became ever stricter, something extraordinary happened across occupied and embattled Europe. Communities rediscovered knowledge that their ancestors had possessed for centuries. Foraging, an ancient practice nearly abandoned by modern industrial societies, returned as a legitimate survival strategy. In the Netherlands, during the devastating hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, when Nazi occupation and failed harvests created a genuine famine, Dutch citizens consumed sugar beets meant for cattle feed and tulip bulbs that no one had thought to eat in generations. The bulbs were starchy and provided crucial calories when nothing else was available. In woodlands and hedgerows across Britain and continental Europe, wild nettles were gathered and cooked into nutritious soups. Blackberries were harvested with religious fervour. Dandelion greens appeared on dinner tables. Beyond foraged foods, governments and agricultural scientists performed remarkable feats of culinary and chemical innovation. When coffee and cocoa became impossible to import, substitutes were developed using roasted chicory root, carob seeds, and even acorns ground into powder. More significantly, legumes, lentils, peas, dried beans, were elevated to central importance in wartime diets. In Britain, the legendary Woolton pie, promoted tirelessly by the Ministry of Food, became a symbol of wartime culinary reinvention. The science of wartime rationing reveals something that, honestly, modern nutritionists find genuinely fascinating. Despite the hardship and scarcity, many civilians actually experienced better health during the war than they had during peacetime prosperity. Rationing enforced strict caloric limits, certainly, but those limits were scientifically calculated. The wealthy couldn't buy their way out of hunger. Everyone faced the same ration books and the same scarcity. This unintended consequence created a more equitable food system than existed before or after the war. The role of victory gardens cannot possibly be overstated. These weren't hobby gardens or quaint pastimes. They were strategic food production units, each one a small act of resistance against the blockade and the threat of starvation. The psychological impact was as important as the caloric one. By growing food, ordinary citizens weren't merely waiting passively for ships to deliver supplies. They were active participants in their nation's survival. Behind these public-facing initiatives stood an often invisible army of agricultural scientists, farmers, and food technicians. These were the unsung heroes whose work prevented the widespread famine that could have broken civilian morale and potentially altered the war's outcome. The Second World War was more than a political and military catastrophe. It was a watershed moment for global food systems. The innovations born from desperation didn't vanish when peace returned. The development of powdered eggs, dehydrated vegetables, and canned goods that had been perfected during wartime remained in use and continued to evolve. More subtly, the dietary shifts forced by rationing proved to have lasting effects on entire populations. The British, for instance, had historically consumed large quantities of meat, sugar, and imported goods. The war forced them toward a diet richer in vegetables, grains, and legumes. The war also crystallized the idea that governments bore responsibility for ensuring food security, not merely during crises, but as a permanent feature of national policy. Today, as we confront unprecedented challenges from climate change, supply chain fragility, and geopolitical uncertainty, the story of WWII's food innovations has become not a historical curiosity but an urgent contemporary lesson. The rise of urban farming, community gardens, and the modern local food movement are direct spiritual descendants of the victory gardens. Perhaps most importantly, the story of WWII's unsung crops teaches us that when genuine necessity arrives, human ingenuity and adaptability can overcome what seemed impossible. The world's population learned to eat differently, to value resources differently, and to see potential in plants and techniques that had been abandoned in the rush toward industrial efficiency. The story of WWII's forgotten food heroes is a reminder that history's most crucial lessons often come not from battles and treaties, but from the quiet innovations of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. If this journey through wartime agricultural ingenuity has captivated you, We invite you to join the Ancient Edge community and continue exploring the hidden knowledge of the past. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most overlooked turning points. Share this video with fellow history enthusiasts who hunger for untold stories. And continue exploring, because the wisdom of our ancestors, tested in the crucible of survival, speaks urgently to the challenges we face today. The past isn't merely gone, it's a guide for what we can become.